Greetings, salutations, and welcome to Linux Lifestyle. I am your host, Michael Kornblum. So, on the last video in this series, I'm going to step out from behind the slides to talk about whether or not you should make the switch to a Linux distribution, or if you should use it in tandem with the OS that you're already using. For starters, I've used Linux distributions as my primary operating systems of choice for about 15 years now. The thing that drew me into this ecosystem was a fascination with the open source software movement. However, the fact that I could get things done with Linux continues to keep me here to this day. With this being said, it was not until at least 5 years into my Linux journey where I could say that I use a Linux distribution as my primary workaday operating system of choice. So, I'm not going to be that guy who says, drop everything you're doing, nuke and pave that hard disk, and install Arch this second. Instead, I'm going to walk you through the decision-making process. We're going to carefully look at the pros and cons of running Linux on your PC, and where it should be installed so as not to ruin your everyday workflow. Now, let's look at a few pros. First off, many Linux enthusiasts will tell you that due to its open source nature, Linux and its applications can be downloaded, installed, and used for free of charge. This statement is mostly true. However, there are also rare cases in which Linux distributions and free software actually cost money. Remember, one of the freedoms of the GPL is that software can be distributed for a fee. An application source code must be freely available to users in order for it to be GPL compliant, but its authors can still charge money for compiled versions of the software. This is one of the many ways that free software will be able to generate income. Another thing enthusiasts will tell you is that Linux will breathe new life into older PCs. Once again, this statement is mostly true. However, you still have to manage your expectations. For example, some Linux distributions no longer support systems with a 32-bit processor, and those that do will often not have the same software selection of their 64-bit counterparts. Similarly, an older 64-bit system with 2 gigabytes of RAM will not run a resource-intensive application like a video editor or audio recording software. Another thing commonly stated by enthusiasts is that Linux distributions are more secure and less likely to fall victim to malware, viruses, or security exploits. These statements are, for the most part, true. The vast majority of software that exists in the wild was created for Windows-based operating systems and not for Linux. Additionally, since Linux-based distributions consist mostly of open-source software, many security vulnerabilities are discovered faster by third-party audits and subsequently fixed by the development community. However, this does not mitigate the fact that you, as a computer user, should act responsibly. Update your system frequently. Use a password manager. Do not open strange emails or take unreasonable risks. This is a common sense statement that goes for Windows and Mac users as well as those who use Linux. Now, let's move into the concerns of running a Linux distribution. First, there's the one that prevented me from making Linux my primary OS of choice for many years, namely hardware compatibility issues. In the early days, many users had problems with hardware components like wireless networking cards, video cards, printer drivers, etc. These problems are far less prevalent than they were back in the day, but occasionally you will still run across them when you buy cheaper hardware or white box components. First off, you should do research before committing to a full Linux installation. This means going on your search engine of choice and looking up the name of the hardware you intend to install Linux on, along with the distribution you're interested in. Determine if there are going to be hardware issues and if there are potential workarounds. Another thing you could do is to test Linux on your prospective hardware of choice using a live disk. A live disk is a semi-functioning installation of a Linux distro that runs off a USB device and your system's memory. Since live disks are only intended to demonstrate how a distribution works with your PC's hardware, they do not touch your hard drive. Once the disk is removed, your PC will revert to its previous state as if nothing ever happened. If this all sounds too magical to you, that's okay. Emulation and some of your system resources to create a nested computing environment. Virtual machines require management software like VirtualBox or VMware Player to be installed. But if you only have one PC at your disposal, this may be a good option for installing, testing, and using a Linux distribution. Once again, I will release a video on how to use virtual machines. Finally, there are online vendors who sell desktop and notebook PCs with Linux distributions pre-installed. These include established names like Dell, Lenovo, and HP, as well as boutique vendors like System76, Entroware, and Tuxedo Computers. Another concern to look at is the issue of software availability. Here is where many prospective Linux users will find themselves running back to their operating system of choice, although by using Linux, you really don't need to give up those apps that you've grown used to. Another con to look at is the issue of software availability. Another con to look at is the issue of software availability. Here is where many prospective Linux users will find themselves running back to their proprietary operating systems of choice, although by using Linux, you really don't need to give up those apps that you've grown to know and love. To get over the software availability issue, I suggest taking these steps. First, make a list of the applications you use on your current OS of choice. In many cases, such as web browsers, text editors, and media players, there may already be ports of your old favorites that are ready to go under Linux. If this is not the case, look for open source or proprietary alternatives of these applications that do run on Linux. And yes, there are proprietary applications that were made to run on Linux. In many cases, these apps will also be available on your current OS of choice. If not, create a virtual machine, or if hardware permits, a real installation of a Linux distribution to try out these software alternatives. Additionally, in some cases, it may be possible to run some Windows-based software on Linux through the use of a translation layer called Wine. Setting up Wine can be a bit complicated for the average user. However, there are applications which make it easier. Some of these applications include Play on Linux and Lutris, which are both included on most Linux distributions. Then there's Crossover Office, which is available through a commercial subscription model, and Proton, which is available through the Steam Play Store. Finally, if all else fails, bear in mind that you can run multiple operating systems. You don't have to abandon your old OS for Linux. The final con I will look at is the learning curve. Here, I will admit that if you come from a Mac or Windows environment, there will be some profound differences between how to get things done from one